Hello and welcome to the Intentional Brief, your weekly video update on the one big thing in cybersecurity news for middle market companies, their investors, and management teams. I'm your host, Shay Colson, managing partner at Intentional Cybersecurity, and you can find us online at intentionalcyber.com. Today is Monday, July 21st, 2025, and while ransomware and 0 days continue, we're going to zoom out a bit and focus on some of the meta messaging here in an effort to get ourselves better prepared for these eventualities. So the question I want us to focus on this week is what happens when things go away. So the Citrix NetScaler vulnerability, now having been dubbed Citrix Bleed 2, continues to see lots of exploitation in the wild, but the weekend was actually dominated by a newly discovered vulnerability in Microsoft SharePoint. This vulnerability 2 also has a name. That's how you can tell it's serious. It's being called Tool Shell. CISA and Microsoft published a joint alert on Sunday indicating just how much impact this might have. Though it should be noted this only impacts on-premise SharePoint servers, which is a diminishing number anymore given that the push to SharePoint Online has been happening for a decade or so. But the vulnerability, according to the release, quote, provides unauthenticated access to systems and enables malicious actors to fully access SharePoint content, including file systems and internal configurations, and execute code over the network, unquote. That is not great. The Washington Post puts this in their coverage as a, quote, global hack, unquote, noting that at least 2 federal agencies as well as several state-level groups were impacted here in the United States. The article also notes that Microsoft flubbed their initial suggestion of remediation, writing, quote, after first suggesting that users make modifications to or simply unplug SharePoint server programs from the internet, the company, being Microsoft, on Sunday evening released a patch for one version of the software. 2 other versions remain vulnerable, and Microsoft said it is continuing to work to develop a patch. The company declined to comment further, unquote. So this brings us to, I think, the good question for us to ponder this week as we continue to face uncertainty ahead in the macro sense. What happens to our business if these tech resources simply go away? Netflix pioneered some work in this area with their approach to what they called chaos engineering, writing a tool called Chaos Monkey that pseudo-randomly picked a server from their production deployment within AWS and kills it, driving resiliency throughout the system with the assumption that services will eventually become unavailable. The engineers should account for that in their deployment, and we should test that in production so that we know what will happen. So I'm not suggesting that you start running around and killing services in your environment or flipping switches or pulling out cords from the back of boxes, but I do think it's worth putting some planning around these notions of availability and what happens when those go away. It's no longer far-fetched that your SharePoint instance could suddenly become unavailable tomorrow. In fact, the WAPO article flagged, quote, one state official in the eastern U.S. who said that attackers had hijacked a repository of documents provided to the public to help residents understand how their government works. The agency involved could no longer access the material, but it wasn't clear whether it was deleted, unquote. Obviously, this is kind of documents that they want to make public, and that's maybe not as big of an impact as internal stuff, but they can't access the repository and they don't know if it's still there. Information like this is going to be something that we are going to need to rely on, and your business is going to need to rely on. So how do you know what you're going to do when those things aren't there if you don't think about it? And some of those things might not be systems. It might be information sharing. There was a piece in Politico this morning that noted there's some solid discussion around a law known as CISA 2015, or the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act of 2015, which is, quote, a bill to make it easier for companies to share personal information with the government, especially in cases of cybersecurity threats, unquote. That discussions around this bill and renewing it have stalled, and that the law itself may not get renewed in the current legislative session and would expire at the end of September this month. Again, a resource that simply goes away. Planning for when capabilities go away is no longer a hypothetical. So if you have not put in the time to think these things through, start with the most business critical elements and work out from there. How long could we live without this resource? What would alternative operations look like? What are the knock-on effects of this outage throughout my business and the supply chain that I'm a part of? What communications, both internal and to customers, should happen? When, how, and by whom? Take these steps towards resilience now and then stick with this process, because once the outage is happening, it is too late to plan. From a fundraising perspective, another solid week, also featuring nearly $20 billion in newly committed capital, just like last week, including a couple of very strong raisers from Stone Point Capital, the PE firm focused on financial services, who closed their Trident X fund with $11.5 billion in newly committed capital, $2.5 billion larger than their last fund, Trident 9, and Neuberger Berman, who closed their NB Strategic Co-Investment Partners 5 fund with over $2.8 billion in committed capital to that fund. A reminder, you can find links to all the articles we talked about about in the comments section below. You can find back issues and written transcripts of these videos at intentionalcyber.com, and we will see you next week for another edition of the Intentional Brief.